If you believe that modern royal privilege is strictly confined to squandering tax revenue or evading financial regulations, today's dossier will violently correct that assumption. The Nordic crown presents the dark archives of Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel of Savoy, the tuxedo-clad executioner of the European aristocracy. The public may vaguely recall him for instigating the most embarrassing brawl in royal history, throwing a punch right in front of the former Queen Anne-Marie of Greece. Yet, that thuggish public spectacle pales in comparison to his 1978 atrocity. Driven by a trivial, unhinged rage, the exiled prince wielded a military-grade rifle to gun down a 19-year-old boy sleeping peacefully on a boat. Shielded by the arrogance of his blue blood and a bottomless fortune, he made a mockery of the European justice system for 13 years, manipulating witnesses and securing a structurally impossible acquittal. It wasn't until decades later that a secret prison wiretap finally exposed his absolute cold-blooded sociopathy. This is the ruthless dossier of a murderer who freely strolled through the palaces of Europe, exposing the terminal corruption of the elite establishment. In the clinical pathology of elite criminality, the escalation from systemic white-collar corruption to kinetic, lethal violence rarely occurs within the highly regulated visible spaces of a functioning metropolis. It requires a specific geographical incubator, a highly sanitized, isolated environment fundamentally insulated from the prying eyes of the working class, the investigative press, and the immediate jurisdiction of local law enforcement. In the late 1970s, that precise incubator was Cavalo Island, a hyper-exclusive, privately owned enclave located in the Lavezzi archipelago between Corsica and Sardinia. Accessible exclusively by private yacht or chartered helicopter, Cavalo did not merely function as a luxurious Mediterranean retreat. It operated as a de facto microstate of impunity. It was a floating fortress of granite and crystal-clear water where the European ultra-rich exiled monarchs and industrial oligarchs congregated to indulge in their supreme isolation, entirely liberated from the democratic gaze. It was within this insulating cocoon of absolute unchecked privilege on the night of August 18, 1978, that Crown Prince Vittorio Emanuele's latent psychopathy was violently activated. The catalyst that triggered this catastrophic rupture was not a political assassination attempt, a violent home invasion, or a legitimate security threat. It was a catalyst so staggeringly trivial, so profoundly insignificant, that it defies rational human comprehension and forces a re-evaluation of the aristocratic mind. The inciting incident was, in objective reality, a microscopic logistical inconvenience. A group of young, affluent vacationers, returning from a dinner on the island, had temporarily unmoored and utilized the prince's rubber Zodiac dinghy to ferry themselves to their anchored yachts in the harbor. In any functioning civilized society bound by the basic tenets of proportional response, this constitutes a minor annoyance. It warrants a raised voice, a stern reprimand, or, at the absolute maximum, a formal complaint filed with the local harbor master the following morning. But one must analyze this infraction through the warped, sociopathic, cognitive lens of the exiled heir to the Italian throne. For Vittorio Emanuele, a man whose fragile, overinflated ego was permanently bruised by his family's historical deposition, and whose entire identity was predicated on a throne he could never legally occupy. This was not a prank by intoxicated youth. It was perceived as an act of absolute lèse-majesté. It was an intolerable existential violation of his sovereign territory by inferior subjects. The unauthorized use of his rubber boat was interpreted as a direct assault on the crown itself. This psychological framework of absolute entitlement dicta led a response of catastrophic asymmetrical violence. Operating under the delusion that he possessed the sovereign authority to execute summary justice within his domain, the prince completely bypassed the local civil authorities. He did not seek a diplomatic or legal resolution. Instead, he made a conscious, premeditated decision to escalate a maritime parking dispute into a theater of war. Leaving the opulent safety of his villa, Vittorio Emanuele armed himself with a weapon of devastating kinetic potential. He did not grab a flare gun or a defensive sidearm. He selected an M1 Garand. This was a high-powered semi-automatic military rifle, fundamentally engineered for the battlefields of the Second World War to pierce human armor and neutralize advancing infantry at long distances. The forensic reality of this moment is chilling. A man draped in the historical legacy of European royalty, gripped by a primitive, unchecked rage, marching down to a civilian harbor with a weapon designed for industrialized slaughter. As he strode into the pitch-black Mediterranean night, the prince was no longer merely an exiled aristocrat clinging to a vanished kingdom. He had weaponized his profound psychological grievances. The ecosystem of Cavalo Island, with its unspoken promise of elite immunity, had provided him the perfect stage. He was stepping onto the docks not to reclaim a stolen dinghy, but to forcefully reassert his absolute supremacy over a world that had dared to inconvenience him. The trigger finger of the House of Savoy was itching for retribution, and the lives of the young civilians sleeping in the harbor were about to be abruptly, violently subordinated to the terrifying whims of a phantom king. When Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel descended upon the harbor of Cavalo Island in the early hours of August 18th, 1978, he did not approach the anchored yachts as a civilian seeking the return of his property. He approached as a mechanized, one-man execution squad. The vessels in question, primarily the yachts Coke and Mapaggia, were occupied by a sleeping contingent of young Italian and German vacationers. They were entirely unarmed, utterly oblivious to the sociopathic rage brewing on the shoreline, and fundamentally unequipped to handle a military-grade assault. The ensuing sequence of events strips away the final microscopic layer of the prince's aristocratic veneer, exposing the cold, reptilian mechanics of a killer operating under the absolute certainty of his own legal immunity. The tactical reality of the confrontation was breathtakingly asymmetrical. Boarding the vessels with the M1 Garand rifle, Vittorio Emanuele initiated a hostile, aggressive verbal altercation with the awakened, bewildered passengers. The historical record indicates a chaotic exchange of shouts in the darkness, a surreal collision between the panicked confusion of youth and the lethal, unyielding entitlement of an exiled monarch. But the prince had not retrieved a weapon of war merely to intimidate. Driven by a volatile cocktail of bruised ego and historical grievance, he elevated the confrontation from a verbal dispute to an act of lethal, kinetic violence. He discharged his weapon twice. To fully grasp the sheer atrocity of this action, one must clinically analyze the ballistics of the M1 Garand. This rifle fires a .30-06 Springfield cartridge, a massive high-velocity projectile explicitly designed for military combat, capable of maintaining lethal kinetic energy over vast distances and penetrating standard battlefield cover. It is not a weapon utilized for warning shots. It is an instrument of absolute termination. The prince did not fire these rounds into the air. He fired them horizontally, blindly, directly into the fiberglass infrastructure of the civilian vessels, demonstrating a sociopathic disregard for human life that borders on the incomprehensible. The trajectory of the second projectile executed a horrific random geometry of death. The mill, a Terry-grade bullet ripped effortlessly through the hull of the yacht, transforming the protective shell of the boat into deadly secondary shrapnel. It invaded the claustrophobic space of the lower cabin, seeking out its entirely unwitting target. That target was Dirk Hamer, a 19-year-old German student. It is an absolute clinical imperative to establish Hamer's role in this tragedy to fully measure the depravity of the prince. Hamer was entirely, unequivocally innocent. He had zero involvement in the prior dispute over the rubber dinghy. He had not participated in the dinner, nor the unmooring of the Zodiac. He was merely a guest on the boat, completely asleep in his bunk. He was forcefully, violently ripped from his slumber by a supersonic projectile tearing through his flesh. He was collateral damage in the truest, most agonizing sense of the term. A civilian sacrificed on the altar of an aristocrat's shattered vanity. The catastrophic ballistic trauma inflicted upon the 19-year-old was horrific. The high-velocity round obliterated Hamer's leg, severing the femoral artery and shattering the femur into jagged fragments. The lower cabin of the luxury yacht was instantaneously transformed into a slaughterhouse. In the suffocating darkness, the sleeping teenager awoke to an unimaginable physical agony, his life force rapidly pumping out onto the floorboards of the vessel. This single cowardly gunshot did not grant the victim the mercy of a rapid death. Instead, it initiated an agonizing, excruciating 3-month descent into physiological hell. Dirk Hamer would endure multiple amputations, catastrophic septic shock, and unimaginable psychological torture in a sterile hospital bed, fighting a losing battle against the necrosis spreading through his body before finally expiring on December 7th, 1978. Yet the ultimate terrifying diagnosis of the prince's pathology was established in the immediate seconds following the gunfire. Confronted with the agonizing, blood-curdling screams of a mutilated teenager echoing across the water, Vittorio Emmanuel displayed a terrifying absolute absence of baseline human empathy. He did not drop his weapon in horror. He did not attempt to administer vascular tourniquets or offer emergency medical assistance. He did not surrender to the harbor authorities or express a singular molecule of regret. Having successfully executed his perverted version of sovereign justice, the tuxedo-clad executioner simply turned his back on the carnage he had orchestrated, securing his weapon and retreating to the opulent safety of his villa. The trigger had been pulled, a boy was bleeding to death in the dark, and the Prince of Savoy was already calculating his next move. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of a kinetic trauma event, emergency medical protocols dictate the critical importance of the golden hour, the narrow 60-minute window wherein rapid medical intervention offers the highest statistical probability of preventing death from severe hemorrhage. However, in the sociopathic ecosystem of the global elite, this precise chronological window is repurposed for a profoundly different objective. For Crown Prince Vittorio Emanuele and the House of Savoy, the golden hour was not utilized to stabilize the shattered vascular system of Dirk Hamer. It was aggressively, ruthlessly exploited to stabilize the legal liability of the crown and to initiate the systematic contamination of objective truth. While the 19-year-old German student lay bleeding in the lower cabin of the yacht, descending rapidly into hemorrhagic shock amidst the panicked, desperate screams of his friends, a chillingly sterile and highly efficient parallel operation was commencing just a few hundred yards away. Retreating to the opulent, fortified sanctuary of his Cavalo Island villa, Vittorio Emmanuel did not immediately contact the French emergency medical services, nor did he surrender himself to the local gendarmerie. Instead, he activated a transnational crisis management apparatus that only limitless generational wealth can purchase. He reached for his telecommunications network and began dispatching orders to a syndicate of high-powered legal mercenaries, geopolitical fixers, and public relations executives based in Paris, Rome, and Geneva. The primary, immediate objective of this royal defense network was not simply legal representation. It was epistemological warfare. Before the first rays of the Mediterranean sun had even breached the horizon, the prince's apparatus had already initiated a comprehensive multi-tiered strategy of evidentiary sabotage. The crime scene, the blood-soaked harbor of Cavalo, was deliberately allowed to descend into administrative chaos. In the critical hours before formal, unbiased ballistic investigators could properly secure the area. The narrative was actively being engineered. The objective reality of an unprovoked military-grade assault on sleeping civilians was aggressively dismantled and replaced with a highly curated, strategically ambiguous fiction. The prince's fixers began planting the seeds of forensic doubt. They introduced the entirely fabricated hypothesis of a phantom second shooter operating in the darkness, and they deliberately conflated the timeline of the prince's warning shots with the fatal projectile that struck Hamer. The physical evidence, including the specific weaponry handled that night, was subjected to immediate, opaque manipulation. The goal was not to prove innocence, which was empirically impossible, but to manufacture a sufficiently dense fog of reasonable doubt that would eventually paralyze a courtroom. Simultaneously, the royal public relations machinery launched a ruthless preemptive strike against the continental press. By the time the bewildered, traumatized teenagers on the yachts were finally giving their initial statements to the local police, the global media narrative had already been hijacked by the use of Savoy. The sophisticated PR executives executed a masterclass in victim blaming and role inversion. They subtly yet pervasively recast the innocent sleeping victims as a mob of aggressive, intoxicated vandals who had violently trespassed upon royal property, thereby forcing a terrified prince to take extreme defensive measures to protect his wife and his estate. Vittorio Emmanuel, the tuxedo-clad executioner who had actively hunted civilians with an M1 Garand, was instantaneously repackaged for the morning editions of the European newspapers as a tragic, vulnerable patriarch who had simply panicked in the dark. The sheer velocity and financial weight of this media manipulation were staggering. It demonstrated that for the aristocracy, reality is not an objective set of facts to be discovered by a judicial system. It is a highly malleable commodity that can be purchased, molded, and distributed to the public before the police have even finished drawing the chalk outlines. When the medical evacuation helicopters finally arrived to transport the critically mutilated Dirk Hamer to a mainland trauma center, the most devastating phase of the crime had already been successfully executed. The physical bullet had shattered the boy's leg, but the Royal Defense Network had already shattered the integrity of the investigation. The prince had not merely fired a weapon. He had triggered a sprawling multi-million-dollar architecture of systemic obstruction. The battle lines were drawn not in the pursuit of justice, but in the defense of absolute privilege, setting the stage for one of the most agonizing, protracted, and humiliating wars of legal attrition in the history of the modern European Republic. To truly comprehend the catastrophic failure of justice following the execution of Dirk Hamer on Cavalo Island, one must completely discard the romanticized cinematic notion of the courtroom as a sacred arena where empirical truth inevitably conquers falsehood. In the highly stratified sociopathic ecosystem of the global elite, the legal system is never engaged as an arbiter of morality. It is viewed strictly as a logistical battlefield, a hostile terrain that can be successfully navigated, manipulated, and ultimately conquered through the strategic, relentless deployment of unlimited capital. For the working class, a criminal indictment is a swift, decisive guillotine that instantly obliterates their financial and social standing. For the transnational aristocracy, such as Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel of Savoy, an indictment is merely the commencement of a siege. He did not need to empirically prove his innocence, an impossibility given the ballistic and eyewitness realities of August 18th, 1978. He merely needed to execute a war of legal attrition so massive, so bureaucratically exhausting, and so profoundly expensive that it would eventually strangle the French Republic into submission. The architecture of this systemic strangulation was built upon a profound understanding of the French inquisitorial justice system. The French legal apparatus relies heavily on the juge d'instruction, an investigating magistrate tasked with compiling a comprehensive dossier of evidence before a case can even proceed to a formal trial. The prince's defense syndicate, comprised of the absolute most ruthless and highly compensated legal mercenaries in Paris, Geneva, and Rome, recognized that this meticulous, paper-heavy process was the system's fatal vulnerability. They weaponized the very procedural safeguards designed to protect the innocent, transforming them into instruments of institutional paralysis. Every single forensic report generated by the state was aggressively contested. Every ballistic trajectory charting the path of the M1 Garand bullet was immediately met with contradictory, highly technical counter-evaluations produced by privately retained experts. The objective was not to clarify the events of that night, but to engineer a chestia of permanent epistemological gridlock. They buried the French magistrates under mountains of contradictory legal filings, injunctions, and procedural appeals, forcing the machinery of justice to grind to an agonizing bureaucratic halt. However, the manipulation of paperwork was merely the sterile surface of the defense strategy. The true brutality of this campaign was executed through the contamination of the human element. Cavalo Island, despite its exclusive isolation, existed within the broader socio-economic orbit of Corsica, a region characterized by its own complex, deeply entrenched networks of patronage, silence, and informal power structures. The royal defense apparatus allegedly engaged in a systematic, highly funded campaign of witness pacification. In the crucial months following the shooting, the initial, terrified testimonies provided by dock workers, harbor officials, and even some of the young vacationers present on the yachts began to mysteriously morph. Concrete observations softened into ambiguity. Absolute certainties regarding the prince's actions dissolved into a hesitant conjecture. It was within this engineered fog of memory that the defense introduced their masterstroke of legal fiction, the theory of the phantom shooter. Despite the prince admitting to firing his military-grade rifle twice in the dark, his lawyers constructed a convoluted, ballistically absurd narrative suggesting that a second unidentified assassin had been lurking in the shadows of the Corsican harbor, and that it was this unknown entity's bullet that had struck Dirk Hamer. This phantom didn't need to be empirically proven to exist. It only needed to exist within the legal transcripts. It was a synthetic variable injected into the equation for the sole purpose of establishing the holy grail of criminal defense: reasonable doubt. By polluting the evidentiary pool with ghost stories and retracted testimonies, the defense syndicate ensured that the French magistrates perpetually chasing shadows instead of prosecuting a royal killer. The sheer, crushing asymmetry of this legal warfare is most devastatingly illustrated by the solitary, agonizing crusade of Birgit Hamer, the victim's older sister. While the House of Savoy operated as a monolithic, faceless corporation deploying millions of dollars to protect their apex asset, Birgit was forced to fight this transnational leviathan entirely alone. A successful model whose life trajectory was violently derailed by the murder of her brother, she was thrust into the role of independent investigator, legal advocate, and relentless historical archivist. The French state, operating under the paralyzing influence of diplomatic sensitivity, offered her virtually no institutional support. The government clearly viewed the prosecution of the exiled Italian heir as a profound geopolitical inconvenience, and their inertia reflected a tacit desire for the case to simply evaporate. Birgit Hamer's 13-year struggle exposes the true, invisible violence of legal attrition. It systematically transfers the suffering from the perpetrator to the family of the victim. She was subjected to a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. She endured anonymous threats, aggressive surveillance, and the terrifying, isolating realization that she was fighting an enemy that operated with absolute impunity above the law. The financial disparity was grotesque. The prince could write off millions in legal fees as a standard operational expense, drawing from a bottomless well of generational wealth. Birgit was forced to sacrifice her career, exhaust her personal savings, and surrender her youth simply to keep the investigation from being quietly dismissed by corrupt magistrates. The system actively penalized her for demanding accountability, punishing her for daring to challenge the divine right of the elite. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, and the 1980s agonizingly crawled toward the 1990s, the royal easytour adage of infinite delay began to yield its ultimate, most cynical dividend: public amnesia. The intense, fiery outrage that had dominated the European headlines in the immediate aftermath of Dirk Hamer's agonizing death gradually dissipated. The 24-hour news cycle moved on to newer scandals, geopolitical crises, and economic shifts. The prince, meanwhile, continued to live his life of unfathomable luxury. He skied in Gstaad, attended high society galas, and managed his sprawling financial empire fundamentally untouched by the bureaucratic warfare being waged in his name. The passing of time acted as a supreme laundering mechanism. By dragging the pre-trial phase out for an incomprehensible 13 years, a period during which witnesses died, memories faded, and evidence degraded, the defense ensured that when the gavel finally fell, the public would be too fatigued to care. The blood had been meticulously scrubbed from the deck of the yacht. The grief of the Hamer family had been commodified and exhausted, and the stage was perfectly, coldly set for the most humiliating judicial capitulation in modern European history. In November 1991, the Palace of Justice in Paris hosted what can only be clinically classified as a macabre state-sanctioned theater of the absurd. 13 agonizing years after the ballistic mutilation and subsequent death of Dirk Hamer, Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel of Savoy finally stood before the Cour d'Assises. The geographical and historical irony of this specific judicial setting was profoundly, almost violently, bitter. Paris, the bleeding epicenter of the French Revolution, a metropolis that had famously decapitated its own absolute monarchs to irrevocably establish the egalitarian supremacy of the Republic, was now the chosen venue for the most humiliating capitulation to aristocratic privilege in modern European history. The trial was never engineered to function as a rigorous forensic inquiry into a homicide. It was structured, managed, and executed as a highly formalized laundering ceremony, a judicial performance designed specifically to legally sanitize a high-net-worth predator and officially restore his geopolitical operational capacity within elite society. From the precise moment Vittorio Emmanuel entered the courtroom, the psychological asymmetry of the proceedings was absolute and suffocating. He did not possess the posture, the physiological markers, or the inherent humility of a defendant facing a potential decade of severe, maximum security incarceration. Instead, he navigated the judicial space with the serene, untouchable arrogance of a visiting foreign dignitary enduring a mildly irritating administrative delay, flanked by a phalanx of the most exorbitantly compensated defense attorneys on the European continent, a syndicate of legal mercenaries who specialized in the dark alchemy of transforming cold-blooded murder into bureaucratic ambiguity. The prince projected an aura of sovereign, impenetrable immunity. He answered the presiding magistrate's inquiries not with the nervous, calculating precision of a man defending his very life, but with the haughty, condescending brevity of a monarch profoundly annoyed by the impertinence of his subjects. The courtroom, theoretically designed as the ultimate equalizer of men before the blind scales of justice, was instantaneously subordinate to the gravitational pull of his blue blood and bottomless bank accounts. The judges, whether consciously compromised or operating through an ingrained systemic deference to supreme wealth, permitted the defendant to entirely dictate the atmospheric and psychological conditions of his own trial. The catastrophic dividends of the 13-year war of legal attrition were immediately, clinically apparent as the evidentiary phase commenced. The French prosecution, structurally exhausted, financially outmatched, and geopolitically unmotivated, presented a case that had been meticulously hollowed out by the defense syndicate over the preceding decade. The objective, empirical reality of August 18, 1978, a man wielding an M1 Garand military rifle and firing blindly into civilian vessels in a fit of aristocratic rage, was actively dissolved into an impenetrable fog of manufactured, synthetic uncertainty. Witness memories, warped by the passage of over a decade and alleged campaigns of systemic pacification, failed to deliver the lethal, definitive strike required for a conviction. But the absolute terrifying zenith of this legal farce was the formal introduction and subsequent judicial tolerance of the phantom shooter hypothesis. The prince's defense team, operating without a singular shred of empirical peer-reviewed ballistic evidence to support the existence of a second assassin operating in the Cavalo harbor that night, boldly injected this ghost into the proceedings. In a functioning, intellectually rigorous court of law, such a blatant, scientifically absurd fabrication would be immediately dismissed as contemptuous desperation, and the attorneys severely sanctioned. Yet the Parisian magistrates permitted this synthetic variable to metastasize within the core narrative of the trial. They voluntarily embraced the cognitive dissonance, allowing the theoretical, entirely unproven existence of an invisible sniper to completely overshadow the physical reality of the prince standing before them, a prince who had explicitly admitted to firing his high-powered rifle in the dark. The defense successfully weaponized the concept of reasonable doubt, stretching it so far beyond the parameters of logic that it became a shield of absolute absurdity. When the gavel finally fell in late 1991, the verdict delivered by the French tribunal did not merely represent a localized miscarriage of justice. It constituted a profound systemic betrayal of the democratic social contract. Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel was comprehensively, officially acquitted of fatal manslaughter. 4 are the unprovoked military-grade assault that resulted in the excruciating 3-month death of a 19-year-old student. The justice system of the French Republic imposed a suspended 6-month sentence. This was a purely cosmetic, functionally non-existent penalty applied exclusively for the illegal possession of a firearm. He was, in essence, handed a minor administrative fine for lacking the proper bureaucratic permit for his weapon of war, while the act of utilizing that very weapon to shatter a human life was entirely permanently expunged from his legal record. This verdict officially, legally codified the license to kill for the transnational elite. It provided empirical historical proof that the architecture of European justice is fundamentally bipartite, a draconian, unforgiving carceral apparatus designed to ruthlessly police, incarcerate, and destroy the working classes, and a highly malleable, infinitely forgiving concierge service reserved strictly for the ultra-rich and the aristocratic. By allowing the prince to walk out of the Palace of Justice as a free man, entirely unburdened by the blood on his hands and smiling for the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, the French state legally endorsed the sociopathic paradigm of Cavalo Island. They confirmed on the official record that a civilian life holds no intrinsic universal value when weighed against the geopolitical convenience and the astronomical capital of a reigning dynasty. For Birgit Hamer, who sat isolated in the gallery and watched the murderers of her brother celebrate their bureaucratic victory, the 1991 acquittal was the ultimate crushing realization of her geopolitical impotence. She had not lost a fair fight in a court of law. She had been forced to participate in a rigged, predetermined game where the fundamental rules of physics, morality, and jurisprudence were simply rewritten in real time to accommodate the survival of the apex predator. The prince returned to his palaces, his EHES, and his luxurious exile, his hands washed clean by the highest magistrates of the land, leaving behind a justice system entirely stripped of its moral legitimacy. In the established psychological literature concerning criminal pathology, a near miss with the carceral system, a narrow evasion of a lengthy prison sentence, typically induces a period of profound operational caution, paranoia, or even temporary behavioral reformation in the offender. However, applying standardized psychological metrics to the transnational aristocracy represents a fundamental analytical error. The 1991 acquittal administered by the Parisian magistrates did not function as a sobering near-death experience for Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel of Savoy. Clinically, it acted as a massive state-sponsored injection of sociopathic validation. By successfully forcing the French judicial apparatus to legally sanitize a homicide that he had explicitly, kinetically orchestrated, the prince did not merely secure his physical freedom. He secured absolute empirical confirmation of his own deeply internalized delusion that he existed in a supreme elevated stratum of humanity, entirely immune to the terrestrial laws governing the masses. The subsequent 15 years constituted an era of unrestrained, spectacular hubris, a period where the tuxedo-clad executioner flaunted his unearned impunity before the very continent he had traumatized. The immediate phase following the Paris verdict required a highly coordinated sociological reintegration into the apex of the European elite. A functioning, morally coherent society would instinctively quarantine an individual heavily implicated in the military-grade slaughter of a sleeping teenager, regardless of the ultimate bureaucratic disposition of the court. Yet the high society ecosystem of the 1990s demonstrated a terrifying collective moral bankruptcy. The aristocracy, the industrial oligarchs, and the geopolitical power brokers of Europe did not ex il Vittorio Emmanuel to the shadows of societal disgrace. They enthusiastically welcomed him back into the fold. He immediately resumed his highly visible, aggressively opulent lifestyle, navigating the exclusive velvet-roped sanctuaries of the continent with chilling nonchalance. From the elite ski chalets of Gstaad to the hyper-exclusive yacht clubs of Monaco and the private dining rooms of Geneva, the prince was insulated by an impenetrable aristocratic omerta. His peers engaged in a synchronized, unspoken agreement to permanently delete the name Durkheim from their collective vocabulary. The elite network functioned as a sociological fortress, actively protecting one of their own from the vulgar consequences of a murder they deemed an unfortunate administrative misstep. This era of sociopathic validation reached its absolute dizzying geopolitical zenith in the winter of 2002. For 56 years, the male heirs of the House of Savoy had been constitutionally barred from setting foot on Italian soil, a permanent exile mandated by the post-war republic as punishment for the dynasty's catastrophic collaboration with Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. However, utilizing the immense momentum of his judicially certified innocence and deploying a sprawling network of political lobbyists in Rome, Vittorio Emanuele successfully engineered the unimaginable. The Italian parliament, succumbing to a lethal combination of historical amnesia and aggressive elite lobbying, formally voted to amend the Constitution, officially lifting the banishment of the Savoy patriarchs. The prince's physical return to the Italian peninsula was not orchestrated as a quiet, penitent pilgrimage of a disgraced historical relic. It was aggressively produced and marketed as a triumphant, quasi-monarchical restoration. In a display of breathtaking, cynical theatricality, Vittorio Emanuele formally swore an oath of unswerving loyalty to the Republican Constitution, the very democratic document his family had actively undermined, and the very legal framework he personally viewed with aristocratic contempt. To further legitimize this geopolitical rebranding, the prince even secured a highly publicized private audience with Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. The visual optics of this specific era are historically nauseating. A man who had utilized an M1 Garand to shatter the life of an innocent 19-year-old was now being formally blessed by the Supreme Pontiff and welcomed home by the highest echelons of the Italian state. The geopolitical laundering was absolute and complete. Empowered by his reinstated status and his legally bulletproof facade, Vittorio Emanuele spent the early 2000s aggressively monetizing his royal brand. He was no longer merely a wealthy exile. He was an active transnational geopolitical broker. Operating out of his luxurious headquarters in Switzerland, he leveraged his restored access to the Italian political elite to establish a highly lucrative, entirely opaque nexus of business operations. He functioned as a high-end facilitator, connecting Middle Eastern sovereign wealth, Eastern European oligarchs, and Western defense contractors, utilizing his royal title to bypass standard corporate due diligence and diplomatic friction. The Phantom King was finally operating within the borders of his ancestral homeland, treating the Italian Republic not as a nation to serve, but as a vast, lucrative geopolitical marketplace to be exploited. However, the most lethal byproduct of absolute impunity is the inevitable erosion of operational security. When an apex predator is permitted to operate for 15 years without experiencing a single consequence for his actions, when he is actively rewarded with papal audiences, parliamentary decrees, and limitless financial expansion after committing a homicide, he fundamentally loses the capacity to perceive threat. Vittorio Emanuele's psychological armor had become so thick, so completely reinforcing, ed by the sycophancy of his courtiers and the cowardice of the European judicial system, that he began to believe his own manufactured myth of invulnerability. He operated under the sociopathic assumption that the license to kill granted to him by the French tribunal in 1991 functioned as a blanket, perpetual immunity against any future legal scrutiny, regardless of the jurisdiction or the nature of the crime. This absolute blinding hubris directly incubated the seeds of his spectacular, inevitable downfall. Believing himself to be entirely untouchable, the prince abandoned the meticulous, paranoid discretion that had characterized his earlier decades. He began engaging in increasingly brazen, structurally reckless subterranean activities, carelessly expanding his illicit networks into the murky, highly monitored underworld of Italian political corruption and organized vice. He failed to recognize that the geopolitical landscape of the mid-2000s was fundamentally shifting. The deferential, easily intimidated magistrates of the 1970s were being replaced by a new generation of aggressive, technologically equipped prosecutors who viewed royal titles not as shields, but as highly attractive targets. The prince, bloated on his own arrogance and blinded by his 15-year winning streak, was carelessly wandering directly into the crosshairs of a massive covert surveillance operation. The era of the Phantom King's unchallenged supremacy was rapidly approaching its expiration date, and the trap that would finally capture his true psychopathic voice was already actively recording in the dark. In the geopolitical ecosystem of the 21st century, absolute impunity is rarely dismantled by a sudden, collective moral awakening of the state apparatus. Rather, it is typically undone by the relentless, invisible encroachment of technological surveillance and the sheer, blinding arrogance of the predator. For 15 years following his grotesque acquittal in Paris, Prince Vittorio Emanuele of Savoy operated under the sociopathic delusion that his title functioned as an impenetrable perpetual force field against the terrestrial machinery of justice. He failed to comprehend a fundamental paradigm shift occurring within the Italian legal system. The deferential, easily intimidated magistrates of the 1970s, men who instinctively bowed to the gravitational pull of blue blood and diplomatic pressure, were being systematically replaced. A new generation of aggressive, technologically sophisticated prosecutors, battle-hardened by the manipulite, clean hands, anti-corruption purges of the 1990s, had ascended. They viewed aristocratic titles not as sacred historical artifacts to be protected, but as highly lucrative, high-profile targets ripe for forensic dissection. The architect of the prince's inevitable downfall was John Woodcock, a notoriously aggressive public prosecutor based in the southern Italian city of Potenza. Woodcock was a magistrate who specialized in the deployment of sprawling covert electronic surveillance networks to dismantle the nexus between organized crime, political corruption, and the entertainment industry. He did not care about the historical pedigree of the House of Savoy. He cared about intercepting encrypted cellular communications and mapping illicit financial networks. Unbeknownst to the prince, who was blithely navigating his newly reclaimed Italian homeland with the swagger of an untouchable monarch, his entire operational matrix had been quietly compromised. The Phantom King had wandered entirely blind into a panopticon, his phone lines tapped, his associates monitored, and his daily movements meticulously catalogued by the very republic he held in such profound aristocratic contempt. The true humiliating reality of the Potenza investigation, subsequently dubbed Savoy Gate or Valletopoli by the Italian press, is found in the sheer, staggering vulgarity of the crimes. Vittorio Emmanuel was not being investigated for grand geopolitical treason, ideological subversion, or the high-stakes military-industrial espionage that characterized the corruption of his peers. The heir to the Kingdom of Italy was being wiretapped for operating a syndicate that functioned with the intellectual sophistication and moral baseline of a low-level mafia franchise. The sweeping indictments prepared by the Potenza prosecutors detailed a sprawling criminal enterprise focused on the illicit procurement of video poker and slot machines for a casino in the enclave of Campione d'Italia. More grotesquely, the prince was heavily implicated in the systemic recruitment and exploitation of prostitutes, specifically targeting young women seeking employment in the Italian television industry to service his network of corrupt businessmen and political fixers. This was the ultimate pathetic degradation of the aristocratic myth. The man who demanded royal deference, who had secured private audiences with the Pope and successfully lobbied the Parliament to rewrite the national constitution, was empirically exposed as a high-end pimp and a peddler of illegal gambling terminals. He had traded the majestic, terrifying violence of a military-grade rifle for the sleazy, neon-lit squalor of extortion and vice. The kinetic shock of the state's retaliation arrived with brutal, synchronized efficiency on June 16, 2006. There were no polite, embossed summons delivered by discreet courtiers. There was no diplomatic back-channeling or quiet negotiations in the drawing rooms of Rome. The Italian law enforcement apparatus executed a sudden, devastating strike. Operating on the direct orders of Magistrate Woodcock, police intercepted Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel on the shores of Lake Como, a bastion of elite tranquility, and immediately placed the 69-year-old aristocrat under formal arrest. The visual and psychological impact of this moment constitutes a profound historical rupture. The impenetrable facade of the Hoe, Yusuf Savoy instantly evaporated in the flashing blue lights of the Carabinieri vehicles. Vittorio Emanuele was physically stripped of his sociological camouflage. He was no longer the untouchable patriarch of an ancient dynasty. He was a criminal suspect, forcibly removed from his luxurious environment, his wrists subjected to the cold, egalitarian steel of police handcuffs. The systemic shock to his courtiers, his high-priced legal fixers, and the broader European elite was absolute. The state had finally breached the velvet ropes, demonstrating that the license to kill, issued in Paris, did not extend to a license for unchecked racketeering in the digital age. However, the most severe psychological trauma inflicted upon the prince was not the public humiliation of the arrest, but the immediate crushing reality of his subsequent incarceration. He was transported southward and locked inside the provincial prison of Potenza. For an individual whose entire biological existence had been defined by limitless spatial freedom, bespoke luxury, and the absolute subservience of those around him, the transition to a sterile, concrete holding cell was a catastrophic psychological amputation. The prison architecture acts as the ultimate equalizer. Inside the walls of Potenza, there were no silk sashes, no titles of nobility, and no butlers to intercept the demands of reality. He was reduced to a biometric data point within the penal system, forced to confront the claustrophobic sensory deprivation of a locked cage. Yet the true genius of the Potenza trap was not merely the physical confinement of the prince. It was the deployment of the holding cell as a highly controlled psychological laboratory. Magistrate Woodcock possessed a profound clinical understanding of elite narcissism. He knew that an individual possessing Vittorio Emanuele's astronomical ego, when suddenly isolated from his public relations handlers and deprived of his sycophantic audience, would experience an overwhelming pathological compulsion to reassert his dominance. The prosecutors deliberately placed the prince in a cell with specific inmates and crucially laced the architecture of the room with highly sensitive covert listening devices. The trap was flawlessly set. Italian prosecutors understood a fundamental truth about the aristocratic psychopath. His deepest vulnerability was an insatiable demand for absolute dominance. The state did not need to subject the prince to aggressive, bright light interrogations. They merely needed to lock him in a cell laced with covert microphones and let his own monstrous ego do the work. Stripped of his royal camouflage and confined alongside common criminals, Vittorio Emanuele experienced a catastrophic narcissistic injury. Desperate to reestablish his supremacy and prove he was the apex predator in the room, the prince would soon begin to talk. He was entirely unaware that the concrete walls were actively recording the darkest secret of the European aristocracy, finally delivering the empirical, acoustic proof of the slaughter on Cavalo Island. It was precisely this desperate, pathetic need for criminal validation that the covert electronic surveillance network was waiting to capture. Hidden within the mundane fixtures of the cell, the microphones operated as an unblinking acoustic microscope, recording the unfiltered reality of the royal mind. What they captured was not a tearful, agonizing moment of penitent reflection, or a guilt-ridden unburdening to a sympathetic priest. They captured a locker room boast, a chilling, jovial, and entirely unprompted resurrection of the ghost of Dirk Hamer, delivered nearly 28 years after the military-grade rifle was fired in the darkness of Cavalo Island. The resulting audio transcription stands as one of the most devastating empirical artifacts in the history of European criminal justice. Engaging in casual, arrogant banter with his fellow inmates, Emmanuel effortlessly discarded the multi-million-dollar legal fiction of the phantom shooter that had secured his freedom in 1991. Speaking with terrifying sociopathic detachment, he explicitly laid claim to the slaughter. The covert microphones recorded him stating, verbatim, "I was in the wrong, but I must say I fooled them. I fooled the French judges." He did not stop at mere admission. He escalated into a state of gleeful, mocking triumph. He characterized the judicial apparatus of the French Republic as profoundly incompetent, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt as he bragged, "They were stupid, I won." To fully comprehend the lethal gravity of this recording, one must subject the prince's vocabulary to a rigorous clinical deconstruction. He does not utilize the language of a man who suffered a tragic accident. He utilizes the language of a chess grandmaster who has successfully humiliated an inferior opponent. In his own words, the agonizing 3-month descent into death of a 19-year-old civilian was reduced to a mere opening gambit in a strategic game of institutional subjugation. The true thrill for the prince was not solely derived from the kinetic act of pulling the trigger of the M1 Garand. The ultimate orgasmic high was derived from looking the highest magistrates of Paris directly in the eye, feeding them an empirically absurd lie, and forcing them to officially swallow it. The 2006 tape proves that he viewed the 1991 trial not as a legal jeopardy, but as a thrilling intellectual exercise, a masterclass in demonstrating that his immense wealth and royal pedigree could successfully paralyze and lobotomize the democratic state. The epistemological shockwave generated by this acoustic autopsy was catastrophic, fundamentally altering the historical parameters of the case. The tape did not merely indict the prince, it served as a retroactive, devastating indictment of the entire French judicial system. The Parisian judges, the highly credentialed magistrates who had formally acquitted him 15 years prior, were acoustically humiliated on a global stage. The tape empirically exposed them as either victims of breathtaking systemic incompetence or willing compromise participants in a state-sanctioned theater of the absurd. Vittorio Emanuele's laughter echoing through the Potenza prison cell was the sound of the aristocracy mocking the very concept of the social contract. It confirmed that the scales of justice had not merely been tipped by high-priced lawyers, they had been entirely dismantled, weaponized, and utilized as a plaything by a killer who found the gullibility of the law to be intensely, sadistically entertaining. For Birgit Hamer, the sister who had sacrificed 3 decades of her life to a seemingly impossible crusade against the House of Savoy, the emergence of the Potenza wiretaps represented the ultimate agonizing paradox. It was the absolute, irrefutable vindication she had sought since 1978. It permanently obliterated the royal smear campaigns that had labeled her family as opportunistic liars, and it empirically validated her unwavering assertion that the prince was a cold-blooded murderer. Yet this vindication was bathed in psychological acid. To secure the truth, she was forced to listen to the unfiltered, recorded reality of the man who slaughtered her brother laughing about the crime. She was forced to hear the absolute lack of humanity in his voice and to confront the terrifying realization that for 28 years, the killer had been walking the earth, attending royal weddings and skiing in the Alps, secretly reveling in the brilliance of his own deception. The Potenza confession permanently stripped away the final protective layer of the tuxedo-clad executioner. It transformed a highly contested legal ambiguity into a cold, historical certainty. The Phantom King had finally been caught not by the brilliant deduction of a detective, but by the sheer gravitational collapse of his own monstrous ego. The state had successfully recorded the inner monologue of a psychopath, preserving it as an acoustic monument to elite impunity. But as the legal mechanism slowly began to grind into motion once more, a terrifying question remained. Would the discovery of the absolute truth finally be enough to pierce the armor of the crown? Or would the system once again find a way to let the prince slip through the cracks of history? The emergence of the 2006 Potenza wiretaps into the global public domain generated a fleeting, intensely euphoric illusion within the European consciousness. For a brief, naive historical moment, the public and the media operated under the assumption that the sudden materialization of empirical acoustic proof, a recorded boastful confession from the perpetrator himself, would inevitably trigger the corrective mechanisms of the democratic justice system. For Birgit Hamer, who had endured nearly 3 decades of systematic gaslighting, institutional stonewalling, and psychological warfare, the tape represented the ultimate, undeniable vindication. It appeared that the insurmountable, multi-million-dollar fortress erected by the House of Savoy had finally been catastrophically breached from the inside, shattered by the sheer careless gravity of the prince's own narcissistic hubris. However, a clinical, unsentimental analysis of European jurisprudence reveals a terrifying structural failsafe, a legal paradox that ultimately functioned as the supreme impenetrable sanctuary for a confessed killer. The foundational legal doctrine of in bis in idem, universally recognized as the principle of double jeopardy, explicitly dictates that a sovereign state cannot prosecute an individual twice for the exact same criminal offense following a formal acquittal. When the Parisian Cour d'Assises delivered its humiliating, structurally compromised verdict in 1991, clearing Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel of fatal manslaughter, they did not merely render a flawed judgment, they irrevocably sealed the criminal dossier. The French tribunal had inadvertently vaccinated the prince against any future legal accountability for the slaughter of Dirk Hamer. The Potenza recording, despite being an acoustic masterpiece of sociopathic guilt, was entirely neutralized by the rigid architecture of the law. It was a sterile artifact, historically devastating yet legally impotent. The justice system, bound by its own procedural rigidity, was forced to acknowledge the confession while simultaneously admitting its absolute inability to apply a carceral penalty. The law itself had been weaponized to protect the apex predator, proving that within the highest strata of the elite ecosystem, jurisprudence does not serve as an instrument of truth. It serves as a bureaucratic firewall against consequence. Faced with the undeniable public exposure of his own recorded voice, a psychologically normalized human being might have finally retreated into the shadows, opting for a quiet, penitent exile. But Crown Prince Vittorio Emmanuel operated on a fundamentally different psychopathic frequency. Instead of expressing a singular molecule of remorse, he executed a maneuver of breathtaking sociopathic audacity. He went on the offensive. Utilizing his bottomless reserves of generational wealth and his syndicate of legal mercenaries, the prince launched a series of aggressive, transnational defamation lawsuits against Birgit Hamer and the investigative journalists who dared to publish the wiretap transcripts. This specific legal campaign represents the absolute rotting nadir of aristocratic entitlement. The tuxedo-clad executioner was actively utilizing the civil courts of the Republic to financially bleed the sister of the boy he had murdered, demanding exorbitant financial compensation for the damage inflicted upon his royal reputation by the broadcast of his own voluntary confession. It was an act of pure disdain, a lead sadism, a deliberate, highly funded strategy to punish the victim's family for refusing to be silenced. The Italian Supreme Court eventually delivered a profoundly complex, bittersweet ruling in 2015 regarding these defamation suits. The highest magistrates of Rome explicitly acknowledged the authenticity of the Potenza wiretaps, formally stating on the historical record that Vittorio Emmanuel was, in empirical fact, civilly and morally responsible for the fatal gunshot that ended Dirk Hamer's life. They legally validated Birgit's decades-long crusade, yet due to the ironclad constraints of double jeopardy, this Supreme Court validation carried absolutely zero kinetic carceral weight. It was a philosophical victory, entirely devoid of justice. The state officially recognized him as a killer, but was constitutionally paralyzed from treating him like one. The biological expiration of Crown Prince Vittorio Emanuele of Savoy on February 3, 2024, serves as the final grotesque insult to the concept of universal accountability. At the advanced age of 86, the exiled heir to the Italian throne did not draw his final breath in the sterile, heavily monitored confines of a maximum security penitentiary, the objective moral destination for a documented, unrepentant murderer. Instead, he died enveloped in the absolute, unmitigated luxury of a private hospital in Geneva, Switzerland. He lived a sprawling, opulent life, continually subsidized by his immense wealth, skiing in the Alps, attending royal weddings, and traversing the globe with diplomatic immunity. He successfully outlived his 19-year-old victim by nearly half a century. The sheer tranquility of his demise is a clinical validation of the most cynical geopolitical axiom. Karma and universal justice are manufactured, sociological pacifiers designed to keep the working classes compliant. In the absolute highest echelons of global society, extreme wealth and a royal title can successfully purchase alternate real ties, rewrite historical consequences, and guarantee a peaceful death for a cold-blooded killer. The closure of this historical dossier must fundamentally center on the legacy of Birgit Hamer. She stands as the ultimate tragic foil to the prince's unearned privilege. Operating entirely outside the protective parameters of the state, she waged a symmetrical war against an asymmetrical enemy. She proved that while the democratic justice system can be bought, intimidated, and paralyzed by the aristocracy, the historical truth can eventually be forcibly extracted through sheer, agonizing human endurance. Birgit achieved historical truth, but she was denied legal justice, perfectly illustrating the lethal distinction between the two concepts in modern Europe. The final historical verdict on Crown Prince Vittorio Emanuele is not merely the biography of a violent, exiled aristocrat. It is a devastating, enduring indictment of the European establishment. It definitively proves that beneath the highly curated public relations campaigns, the philanthropic galas, and the majestic pageantry, the crown fundamentally operates as a dark zone of legal immunity. The prince utilized the democratic justice system not as an arbiter of morality, but as an elite concierge service to clean up the blood he spilled on Cavalo Island. His life meticulously charts the architecture of injustice, leaving behind a cold, unforgiving political axiom. As long as sovereign states continue to venerate the archaic structures of hereditary privilege and allow absolute wealth to dictate legal outcomes, the law will remain nothing more than a spiderweb, strong enough to entangle and destroy the weak, but effortlessly, mockingly torn to shreds by the apex predators of the elite.